Hello, and welcome to the Regional Studies Annual Lecture. My name is Jennifer Clark. I'm the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the journal Regional Studies. I'm also a professor and a head of city and regional planning at The Ohio State University. As Deputy Editor-in-Chief, it is my privilege to chair the lecture today. And I first would like to acknowledge our team of editors at Regional Studies. We have an amazing team, and our team of managing editors and editors have done incredible work over the last 2 years in leading the journal forward through these challenging times. As many of you know, Regional Studies is one of the 5 journals that are called Regional Studies Association Our Home. Regional Studies is a leading international journal in theoretical development, empirical analysis, and policy debate in multi and interdisciplinary fields like regional studies. The Regional Studies Association itself is a global interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development, and policy. The RSA is a membership-based organization, and it supports its members with the latest research, funding schemes, in the US we would say, funding opportunities, networking opportunities, publishing, and spaces to grow one's research and also one's career. In particular, the Regional Studies Association has invested significant time and energy in early career researchers during the recent times. This lecture is part of the RSA journal's annual lecture series. There's a lecture that goes with each one of our journals. This replaces the in-person winter conference presentations that many of you may be used to from previous years, which were normally held in London. You can use the RSA Hub and the RSA's new event app to join discussions, attend events, and network with other participants and members. Some of you are aware that the Regional Studies Association team of incredible staff and leadership have created some amazing tools and opportunities in this remote and virtual engagement world we're now in today. In terms of some general information about this particular webinar, I want to just mention that the webinar will be recorded and it will be made available through the RSA Lounge for anyone who would like to see it at another time. Please, as you go through and have questions that you would like to have us discuss during the Q&A period, please use the question and answer section here, and we would love to get to those when we get to the Q&A after the talk. And please use the hashtag RSA webinar and hashtag RSA journals to tweet about this event. As many of you know, we have quite a virtual presence as the Regional Studies Association and Regional Studies through forums like Twitter. And with that, I would like to turn to introducing our speaker today. So our speaker today is Linda Samuels. And Linda Samuels is an associate professor of urban design at Washington University in St. Louis. She is an architect, an urban designer, and planner whose work focuses on next generation infrastructure design as a tool for environmental and social justice. She teaches interdisciplinary studios and seminars on infrastructural urbanism, urban history and theory, and on sustainability metrics. And in addition to her teaching, she's a very active researcher. She was co-principal investigator on a grant from the Divided City Initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation entitled Mobility for All. So she is an engaged researcher with community. She's also has published extensively. She has published in top journals like the Journal of Planning History and Places. And today she's going to speak to us about her most recent book, Infrastructural Optimism, which is available now from Routledge. This is what she'll be speaking about today, and we welcome Professor Samuels and look forward to her presentation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to the Regional Studies Association for having me today. I am going to share my screen and get started. Everybody see those slides? All right. I'm really excited to be here to talk to this audience today about my latest publication. It's sort of a decade in the making. So I am going to focus a little bit on just part of it, which are the larger case studies. But I want to start by talking about, why optimism. Optimism, particularly infrastructural optimism, is this concept that a more socially equitable and ecologically intact future should be part of the right to the city for everyone. Everyone deserves to believe in a better future for themselves, for their children, and for the planet. I believe that part of that is the idea that we invest in infrastructure as our largest public realm. We produce this idea of infrastructural optimism through what I call infrastructural opportunism. And infrastructural opportunism is a strategy that leverages these already existing investments in large-scale infrastructure, what has typically been our monofunctional, efficiency-focused conduits like highways or power lines. But we leverage this investment instead for added social and environmental benefits. So if we have these opportunities, one of my big questions is really like, why are we building infrastructure like it's 1956 or even 1976 still, when it's really, almost 2022? We are on the verge of investing billions of dollars again in infrastructure as it continues to become obsolete, as environmental challenges intensify, as social inequities persist and widen. And we have to design better infrastructure, but we also have to design infrastructure better. So my question is, how do we go from last generation infrastructure, which is resource intensive, spatially and socially disruptive, and almost always does one thing at a time, and sometimes not that one thing very well, to next generation infrastructure, which contributes to the reduction of these damages and divides. It reintroduces systems-based thinking into city design. It recognizes infrastructure as a public amenity, and it utilizes all of our interdisciplinary skills as designers and thinkers, regional thinkers, macro and micro thinkers, to improve the quality of experience and the quality of life for all who use it, human and non-human alike. So part of the book that I want to share with you today is two of the primary case studies that are included in chapter 4. And I remember that chapter because it was one of the hardest chapters to finally get done. These two case studies have pretty significant contrast in terms of geographic and demographic conditions. So one of them is the Interstate 11 supercorridor, which is the stretch of interstate that is potentially made up of a couple existing interstates with a couple new components. It's about 500 miles of proposed interstate, and it connects, in the big picture, it connects the port at Guaymas, Mexico, all the way to Canada. So it's technically a Canamex corridor. But the section that we looked at was really the primary focus section, which runs from the southern border of Arizona to Las Vegas. The reason that piece in particular is so important is Phoenix to Las Vegas are the two largest cities in the US that don't have an interstate connecting them because they were not large enough when the Eisenhower map was originally drawn. The other case is significantly smaller, and it actually is a little bit different because it focuses more on the sort of social aspects than the environmental aspects. And that's in St. Louis, Missouri, which is kind of central US on the Mississippi River. And that is about 17 miles of Metrolink light rail proposal that would connect the southern part of St. Louis through central St. Louis to the northern part. So the question is, how do we actually change these infrastructure models from past models to future models, or from last generation to next generation? And sometimes I call this going from the red arrow to the green arrow scenario. And I have thought about these three strategies. The strategies are broadening the process, transforming the prototype, and measuring what matters so that we can shift the paradigm. And I want to talk a little bit about each of these. Broadening the process is really about incorporating a wider range of stakeholders early on in the process. designers, planners, ecologists, hydrologists, people who might not be thought about in the very earliest stages of infrastructural planning. Working across agencies and really spreading power to the people who are most affected, the local residents. Transforming the prototype is really about the physical objects. How do we stop designing these physical objects based on some sort of status quo idea of what they should be, moving away from models that are obsolete or unsustainable, and seeking bigger goals beyond efficiency of service. I think we do that by incorporating next generation infrastructure criteria. And then measuring what matters means that we've got to stop thinking about growth as the only solution, as the only measure of success, growth for the sake of growth. And we have to differentiate good dollars from bad dollars. And we have to also recognize the cost of loss. So air pollution is a loss, and we don't account for that loss when we're talking about a bottom line dollar success. We also have to account for the value of social gains. So volunteering, working in the home, these things have never been given the kind of value they deserve in terms of measuring success. And all of that hopefully leads to us shifting the paradigm so that we can reconceptualize infrastructure as a public space core to our quality of life. We can utilize design first and sustainability first as our guiding values rather than engineering only. And we can consider infrastructure as a holistic ecology, recognizing that all of these systems are codependent, interrelated, and should be thought of symbiotically. So how do we get to this point where we are transforming the prototype and shifting the paradigm? The next generation infrastructure criteria that I want to talk about, which sort of guide this idea of transforming the prototype, because it is the one that's most grounded in the design of the built environment. They first emerged out of a competition I worked on at UCLA's City Lab. City Lab is an urban design think tank here in Los Angeles that was started by Dana Cuff and Roger Sherman. And I was a senior researcher at City Lab while I was working on my PhD. And we developed this competition called WPA 2.0, Working Public Architecture. And WPA 2.0 was a call for innovative design-based solutions that would be worthy of a national level effort to revitalize cities and put the public back in public works. That was sort of our thesis statement. And WPA 2.0 was a response to a very particular moment in time. So this was 2007, 2008, the beginning of the Great Recession. So it was also a point in time where there was fairly high unemployment in the design and construction fields. We wanted to capitalize on that sort of latent creative energy. It was also really what I've started calling the disaster decade. So we were having tragic and highly visible infrastructure collapses, the collapse of the levees after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the I-35 West Bridge in Minneapolis. And at the same time, we were starting to pay attention to the ranking of our infrastructure. So the Association of Engineers was giving us a kind of average ranking across the US of a D- of all of our infrastructure. At the same time, the design fields were developing a greater interest in social and environmental accountability that had been foreign to architects other than a sort of select percentage. So this competition attracted about 320 entries globally. And I looked more specifically at the kind of the sort of top tier, the 5 finalists and the winner. So what you see here is an image from each of the 5 finalists, and these are covered pretty thoroughly in the book, and also the names might seem a bit familiar if you have seen recent publications. Almost every finalist has produced work since the competition, so it's been 10 years since this competition, that had seeds in their entry to the competition. So they've taken these ideas of next generation infrastructure and are continuing to practice and expand them. The winning project is by Port, just to give you some glimpse into the project that sort of took the prize. And it's called Tunnel Algae Park. And it was an idea that by creating a bridge across the tunnel that connects Manhattan to Governor's Island, you could capture that CO2. You could turn that CO2 into algae. You could take that algae and turn it into alternative fuels. And at the same time, you would be providing public space. You would add an option to connect to these 2 parts of New York through better biking and pedestrian activity. So you can see how that begins to think about what I'm going to show you as next generation criteria. So all of this analysis that I did of these projects, along with other folks at City Lab, led to the first 7 of the next generation criteria. Those are on the left. So I want to go through them briefly just to give you some sense of what led the design and the case studies. So next generation infrastructure is multifunctional, right? It is no longer enough to invest all that money in something that does only one thing. So everything has to do more than one thing at a time, preferably with relationship among those systems. It is public. So it is not just about public funding, but it is about providing public space that is inclusive, engaged, and supports difference. It is visible. So part of making our resource use more visible means that we are personally accountable for how we use resources, but we are also more accountable as a collective to how we use the commons. Next gen infrastructure is socially productive. So it increases rather than decreases equity. It provides new amenities, access, and opportunities while hopefully decreasing negative impacts. It is locally specific, flexible, and adaptable. So next gen infrastructure can't be obsolete in 10 years or 15 years or even 50 years, but it has to be able to change over time, adapt to people and technology, and accommodate climate disasters that we know are coming. It is sensitive to the eco-economy. So next gen infrastructure recognizes its interconnection of economic and ecological systems and prioritizes reuse, recycle, revitalize, or reinvent. It is also driven by design rather than efficiency only. So it can become design prototypes or demonstration projects, but it is an opportunity for designers to engage quality of environment, aesthetics, and actually sense of place. The next 4 actually came out of work that I did with students and other faculty at the University of Arizona, where I was the director of the Sustainable City Project, and at Washington University in St. Louis, where I teach in the doctoral and master's program now. Symbiotic sort of rises to the top as I looked at some industrial case studies. The idea that the waste of one system can be the fuel for another system to create a sort of waste-free interconnectivity of systems is huge. Technologically smart so that we are improving system performance, safety, and access, particularly in service of interconnection among the different criteria. Developed collaboratively across disciplines and agencies. We have silos now that prevent us from sharing funding and resources and ideas, but connecting agencies and disciplines allows us to find new opportunities for creative solutions. And number 11 is that it operates at both micro and macro scales simultaneously. And this provides a degree of resiliency and adaptability that we don't necessarily get if we're just thinking about systems at the scale we've always thought about them. So I love this one example of going from the red arrow to the green arrow scenario. And that is if we're spending $17 to $75 million per lane per mile on a freeway, we should be getting more than just what the departments of transportation call the flat and black. That is a lot of investment. And what else can we do with that money? So I'm going to talk about these 2 case studies in a little bit of depth. And case study 1 is this Interstate 11 Super Corridor project. And as I said, the portion we looked at is really the span from Nogales, which is at the border of Arizona and Mexico, up to Las Vegas. We ran it as a studio initially, and we had 5 faculty, 59 interdisciplinary students, 3 universities, so University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Arizona State University, and University of Arizona in Tucson, and Arizona State University in Phoenix. And we also worked with the partners at Arizona Department of Transportation, so they were involved from the very beginning, and the Sonoran Institute. And we selected 12 sites across these 500 miles. The idea to begin with, in addition to going red arrow to green arrow, was that this segment of highway has the chance to either be the sort of last segment of last generation freeway or the first segment of next generation freeway. And we wanted to push that latter option. What was really exciting was that ADOT, the Arizona Department of Transportation, was already on board with us. Their initial corridor study had included a couple ideas that were really beneficial. One was multimodality. How do they include space in the freeway for trains or transit? And the other was they were already thinking about bundling infrastructural systems. So they wanted to include potentially things like water reclamation, energy transmission, fiber optic cable in the freeway right of way. So they were on board to this idea. One of the reasons, though, that this freeway was being proposed was obviously for economic development, but also the argument that more lanes is always necessary. You know, we've proven time and time again that more lanes do not solve congestion, but in Interstate 10, that was a big part of the argument. So we wanted to start by debunking that argument and saying, more lanes are not going to solve the problem here, and more lanes are not going to give you the economic development that you're looking for. So we developed sort of three really basic ideas that said, okay, if you do these three things before you do even any other design work, they will offset a lot of the carbon emissions. So design for high density, multifunctionality, and multimodality along the whole route. Second was to shift 10% of the freight from truck to rail. And that would increase inter and intra-city commuter rail in addition, according to ADOT's existing projections. And then the last one was to just shift an additional 1% of vehicles from gas to electric. And all of these things were already in the process. ADOT was already studying these things. But we added up the numbers, as you can see on the right of the screen. Can't miss that yellow. If you just did those things, you would save 2.1 million metric tons of CO2 before you did any additional design work. And that's about a quarter of the 2+ million new anticipated residents offsetting their greenhouse gas emissions. So we started there by saying, do these three simple things first. As a studio, we then did a series of maps looking at the sort of opportunities and challenges of this region. A huge percentage of the state of Arizona is capable of producing solar electricity, yet a very, very, very small percentage of the state actually is run with that solar electricity. So we wanted to identify how much was possible versus the fact that the state's getting a lot of their energy from fossil fuel sources. We also had to look at open space and water. So Arizona has what's called the CAP, the Central Arizona Project, which is where most of the water comes from obviously external sources, Colorado River, et cetera. So the idea that that dark blue line on the left is the canal that runs through the entire state, right? This is not a sustainable solution as water sources change and drought intensifies. So looking at these maps, though, what we realized was this is sort of how we selected our most important sites and our most important issues. So the two projects I want to show you, one is this project called Smart Energy City. And if you see the two columns, the sort of gray column of existing infrastructure on the left is what is evident now in terms of resources of water, energy, data, and mobility. And that column on the right, the hot pink, shows where each infrastructural resource has been enhanced through the design project that you'll see. So the design project for this site was a response to the specific condition here. So a little bit of demographic information. Tucson at this time was the 6th poorest city in the US. A little over 20% of the population was below the poverty line. But Tucson's kind of what I call an infrastructural adolescent city. So it's starting to make some changes by building streetcar and enhanced transit, but it still is building large arterial roads at high speed and has a huge problem with pedestrian fatalities. So this project focused on the site where the new I-11 would intersect with Congress, which is one of the main streets in Tucson. And the focus was to make energy, renewable energy, in every way possible. And so the project actually has a tremendous amount of solar production, also has kinetic energy production and wind energy production, and it utilizes that to create a new renewable energy economy. And this connects back to the city through the new modern streetcar that was actually under construction when I was living there and was completed and is hugely successful. And it then takes the renewable energy and adds to that the idea that water is clearly an issue. So every other aspect of the project is really about harvesting water. So rainfall, air conditioning, condensate, any kind of water that can be harvested on the site to recharge the adjoining river and add additional animal habitat, riparian areas, and recreation space. Each of these projects ended in a diagram like this, which is what I call the results diagram. How do we actually add up the value in a way that's not just talking about dollars, but it's talking about resources distributed, resources gained, and opportunities evident in each of the sites. So the second project is a project in Marana, which is just north of Tucson, and about 30 miles north. And this site is a little bit different. It's got a slightly wealthier population. And it's also located in a place where there's actually substantial water rights. So this was an agrarian location in the state of Arizona. And that those water rights are no longer being used for farming. So these water rights can be utilized to create green space, public space, and greenways. So this project was much more about how you might take that green space and create a new kind of sustainable city that becomes accessible to Tucson through a high-speed rail corridor. And that high-speed rail corridor could then make this a low energy, livable opportunity for people who might commute back and forth to Phoenix or back and forth to Tucson. And again, this project ended in what I'm calling the results diagram. And these are some renderings of the project itself. And this results diagram was really about renewable energy production and water. So all of this water would be, all of the water in the project would be recycled, returned to the project in support of a public greenway. And so in the end, if we go back to that original idea that 20% of the greenhouse gases are offset just by those original 3 ways we want to divert congestion, you then add renewable energy production, water harvesting, smart industry, multimodal options, smart transportation, protected wildlife, and greater public amenities. And this was the argument that we shared with the Arizona Department of Transportation. And luckily their responses, when people have asked them, when they're in the audience, when I'm presenting this work, oh, ADOT will never do this, people say, and ADOT representatives are there, they say, well, we can't afford not to do this. The benefits are just so good. So I'm still waiting to see if that's actually playing out. The second project I want to talk about, which I said is really quite different, is the North Side, South Side Metrolink expansion in St. Louis. And as you can see, this is an image of the Mississippi River. St. Louis is directly on the river, but I wouldn't say it's so much of a river city anymore. We've kind of turned our back to the river, as a lot of cities have, a lot of post-industrial cities. Similar to the I-11 super corridor, though, I would say this is an infrastructural opportunism project. This is a project that's getting ready to have potentially, millions of dollars of investment. And if it doesn't go towards something more than just a train line, we're missing an opportunity. So the grant that Jennifer mentioned at the beginning was for a project called Mobility for All by All. And this is our team. We had organizational partners, project partners, advisors, and students. And the idea was, again, how do we look at this 17 miles of light rail and turn it into something more socially productive than just a train? And just to give a tiny bit of information about St. Louis, we looked at some demographics of the city. The timeline of the city is very complex. St. Louis reached its peak population in 1950 of 856,000. And you can see the population in 2016 was 311,000. So within the city boundary, we've lost 60% of our population in the last 70 years. The 308,000 projection was what we thought we would be in 2045, and we've already gone below that. So our 2020 census is reflecting quite a population loss. The regional population, however, is fairly stable. So the red line that you see on here is the existing east-west Metrolink. So it's already about 46 miles, reaches into the county, has 38 current stations. And then this red line that you see here running north to south is the newly proposed North Side, South Side expansion. So about 17 miles through 15 wards, which makes it kind of a political nightmare, 23 neighborhoods, 29 stations, and up to $2.2 billion of investment. It is directly adjacent to the old Pruitt-Igoe site. So if you're not familiar with Pruitt-Igoe, it's one of the most notorious housing projects built in the United States. It was imploded beginning in 1972, and that site sat vacant for the last 50 years. When I arrived in St. Louis, it was a natural growth forest. It has been the site of racial violence for 75 years, if not longer. This North Side, South Side line connects to that, and it is again a site of contestation because this new National Geospatial Agency project is being built on the site directly next to it. I'm not going to talk about that much, but it gives you some sense of where this is in the city and how it plays into the sort of national imagination of racial discrimination. So the north and south side of St. Louis, this is a little bit of demographic information. It shows you why this is really a line of social equity. The northern side of St. Louis is 98% African-American. It has 42% of the households are at or below the poverty line. median household value is low, and it's a low vehicle area. So not only is this a population that is suffering from generations of institutionalized racism and disinvestment, it would really benefit from this opportunity to connect to jobs and other opportunities. This is a really shocking statistic. I've been starting to see these in multiple cities across the US, but the life expectancy span from North St. Louis to West County, which is the wealthier counties in the St. Louis region, is up to 17 years difference. So depending on what zip code you might be born in, you might have a 15 to 17 year lower life expectancy. So this investment is really about helping to equalize some of those gaps. We did a series of mapping projects also in St. Louis, and I'm going to show you a little bit of a selection of those. But these are important when you recognize how much vacancy there is in North St. Louis. So all of that red area, some of it is industrial vacancy, but a lot of it is previously residential and commercial sites. The map on the right, the darker the red, the more times that site has been cleared or somehow excluded through some kind of a policy mechanism. So it might be housing racial exclusions, it might be eminent domain clearing, but the darker the red, the more times that property and therefore the people on that property have gone through those kinds of violence. So if you look at, I'm going to point out just one site. So the Pruitt-Igoe site is right here, and the NGA, sorry, Pruitt-Igoe is right here, and the NGA site is right adjacent. So those properties have gone through generation after generation after generation of kind of urban renewal and segregation. We mapped the power, who has control, who's in charge politically, who owns the property, what are they doing with it. We looked at environmental justice questions. The map on the right is concentrations of lead levels, and these are taken from schools. And the map on the left is the area that's been targeted by the federal government under a consent decree, $100 million consent decree for the Metropolitan Sewer District to come in and repair our combined sewer and stormwater overflows. So being a city on a river, being places that have flooding, if you have a combined sewer and stormwater, you know that when that stormwater backs up, it means that you might get sewage in your yard or in your house as a product of that backup. So these are potential opportunities where federal funding might be utilized for better engagement and more design work. This is really the kind of economic violence. Every one of those yellow circles is a tax increment finance project. So tax dollars are flooding into that central east-west corridor, which is one of the wealthier corridors in St. Louis, but not to the north and south in the ways that it could be. So we use this mapping as a way to begin to select our project sites. And the 4 project sites you see selected on the left with circles are the projects I want to show you. And we scattered them throughout the north side of the city and the south side of the city. And I'm kind of going to go north to south. I'm just going to cover these briefly. The Thrive at the Convergence project was really about where this new north side, south side Metrolink line would intersect this historical neighborhood of the Ville. So many famous African-American cultural and sports people who are known all around the world were born in the Ville. And the Ville is really a location that has suffered from this disinvestment on the north side, but it has so much history, so much cultural significance. So this project was really about how do we bring that cultural preservation and historic preservation to a bigger audience. Old North New Refuge was a project about utilizing the north side, south side line as a way to serve refugees. So St. Louis has quite a large international population and is very open and welcoming to refugees. And so this would be a way to connect services. We have a neighborhood like this on the south side where we have an international institute that provides language services, housing services, food services, job training, and this would be a similar version inspired by investment with this north side, south side line as a way to connect people through transit. The Karst Urbanism project capitalizes on this idea of the karst landscape, which is sort of the cave, the underground cave landscape in St. Louis. It's why we're a famous beer city. Before there was refrigeration, Anheuser-Busch would store all of their beer in the caves underneath the city. And this project uses that ecological structure as a way to create a water landscape and a new water economy in a South Side neighborhood. And then Two Rivers is a project even further south where they're using shipping containers to store contaminated soil, revitalize that contaminated soil, and then create food production as part of the re-energized aspects of this particular neighborhood. So you can see how we're using the next generation criteria. And even in some cases, we're trying really hard to put a kind of quantifiable number with that next generation criteria. So how much stormwater can we capture? How many people can we feed? How much density can we increase? And even if this is a little speculative, it speaks to the language of people who would potentially invest in these projects and government officials who are going to have to argue for why these projects are valuable. So we're broadening the process, and I'm not going to talk about that as much, though we've done a lot of work around engaging arts organizations and youth in having discussions around what they want from transit and how they can speak up as residents. Those projects are about transforming the prototype. And lastly, I want to talk about measuring what matters, because I think this is really significant to all the work that we do. And I want to talk about this in really two ways: measuring what matters by measuring things that we think are immeasurable, and by shifting away from sort of the standard ways that we have measured success in the past. So the second first, and this is, if you're familiar with GDP, which is typically the way that we, gross domestic product, is typically the way that as a country we sort of gauge success, right? So gross domestic product is the total monetary or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's border in a specific time period. And the thing about GDP that has been criticized from the very beginning, from its invention, is that it measures all dollars, regardless of if they are good dollars or bad dollars. And GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, which is a concept that emerged out of ecological economics, which says, economics is not the big umbrella under which the ecology lands, but ecology is the big umbrella under which economy lands. GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, tries to solve some of these problems that GDP puts forward. So GPI differentiates between good dollars and bad dollars. So war, which might be bad dollars, is not equivalent to building schools, which we might think of as good dollars. It incorporates the cost of environmental damages. So water pollution is a cost. Incarceration is a cost, so social damages as well. And it measures ignored and or invisible gains, like the value of volunteer work, or the value of working in the home, or the value of social connectivity, or what Mindy Full-Love calls rootedness. So we made one attempt in studio to kind of begin to calculate GPI. It was one of those things, kind of 2 days before the final review, we put all of these projects together and said, well, how would we think about this in a bigger light, not just sort of an economic dollar line? And this was a series of projects we did for the Green New Deal Super Studio that was sponsored by the Landscape Architecture Foundation. So you can see here, we tried to look at jobs, we tried to look at intergenerational wealth, we tried to look at tree coverage, green lining, educational attainment. So all of these things that aren't often counted in something that's measuring dollars only. And one example of sort of measuring the immeasurable, I mentioned the Pruitt-Igoe site, and actually this right here is the Pruitt-Igoe site. If you can see my cursor, the trees at the right end of the site, it's just started to be cleared down here. But this bigger site that I'm showing is the site for the National Geospatial Agency. So it is adjacent to the old Pruitt-Igoe site, but it is much bigger. The right bar is the sort of old figure ground. So you can see at the very top, this used to be a dense residential neighborhood. And slowly over the last 30 years, it has been decimated by everything from policy to greed. So this is the current state of the site, 2018. And the city has been so proud of themselves for bringing the NGA to the city limits that I wanted to create an argument that said, well, what is the real cost of this? So in addition to actually the tax incentive financing that they're offering for the organization to move here, the reduction of property costs that they provided, which was a loss to the city. So all of these financial dollars that were lost. I also wanted to look at what was the cost of erasing the last neighborhoods, the last of the neighbors who had lived here for generations. So the kind of figure ground overlay shows the last 5 or 6 neighbors who were holdouts from, 50 years ago. They had their houses passed down from generation to generation. So we couldn't put a number value on this, but we wanted to put a sort of look at the people costs. So the houses that were displaced, so they were not able to buy new houses for the amount of money that they were given, the history that was lost, the personal and collective history, the formal and informal businesses and jobs that were lost, and then the loss of social cohesion. So social cohesion is extremely important for neighbor resilience. It is the fact that you can rely on the people who live near you to fill in a gap or fill in an emergency. That health, resilience, and strength, the loss of that is what Mindy Full calls root shock. So we know that really the original 11 criteria that I've presented, the next gen infrastructure criteria, are significant, and they're going to help us move forward in terms of a next generation infrastructure world. But we also know that benefits and opportunities and our infrastructure are not equitably distributed. We were very much reminded of this again, this last summer, a year ago. And this idea that we are obviously still reckoning with uneven and highly contested production of the spaces that we live. Infrastructure is often one of the largest offending products of that uneven distribution. So even though we might be boldly and visibly taking back space in the name of marginalized and excluded populations, it is valiant, but it is only step one. So by measuring the immeasurable, we have to take into account that damage, but we also have to incorporate steps to somehow make amends. So before the book was published, I started to think about what must be included in the next generation infrastructure to contribute to this idea. And I believe that next generation infrastructure must also repair the damage that's been done and the violence that's been caused to populations, human and non-human, and communities that have been oppressed, abused, or erased from the lands where we hope to build. So I added a 12th criterion, and criterion number 12 is that next generation infrastructure must be reparative. Beyond being socially productive, reparations must reprioritize resources, add agency, and create optimism for those who have been most impacted by institutionalized structures of racism, erasure, and exclusion. So when we put all 12 of these together, next generation infrastructure must bring silenced voices to the head of the table and create infrastructure that really is for all and by all. So as we think about building back better, all of the billions of dollars of investment that we have to include to pull our infrastructure up from obsolescence and move forward with new technologies, it's not just about bouncing back, which was our old definition of resilience, but really bouncing forward to a new condition that serves everyone in our communities. So thank you so much. I would love to hear your feedback and answer any questions you might have.
Linda, thank you so much. That was, my head is sort of spinning about where to start asking you questions. But I think that the first thing I wanted to say to you is that I think your book is so appropriately titled, because the optimism here is really very clear that very often what people do is sort of throw up their hands and say, well, we have to do it the way we've always done it because we're not sure how to do it better. Right? And that's not what you're saying. You're saying we absolutely do know how to do it better. And we know now, like right now, how to do it better. What we don't have the path forward towards is really the will, right? It's the will and the resources. And we indeed have both of those things. We just have to align them. So I'm struck in part by how when we started talking about infrastructure, almost hard infrastructure, this sort of delineation that we think about of hard infrastructure, I think you were saying the blacktop, the idea of just the
flat and
roads,
black,
right?
the flat and black.
Flat and
Yep.
black, right? And then we end up going through mains and drains, right? and then by the end of it, we're talking about really the question of reparative or restorative planning. And I think for so many people in this conversation, the idea that there is a straight line between those things is just not clear very often. And one of the things that you're showing us is that there is absolutely a straight line that connects restorative planning all the way through to the questions of what kinds of roads we build and what kinds of investments we make, not just on any specific site, but in terms of networks of sites. So there are definitely some questions that have been coming through, and some of them are really around this question of the convincing, right? Like, so you've convinced this audience in 45 minutes. So in the convincing of the folks who make the reallocation of resources, right? Who sort of change the policies and the practices. Certainly one of the things that I think is particular in the US, but is that the state departments of transportations in particular hold the purse strings to both economic development and transportation investment money. Mm-hmm. And they are incredibly conservative. Mm-hmm. Not as a political matter necessarily, but as a set of practices. They are very much they view the world through a rear view mirror. And so I'm curious a little bit about how those conversations have gone with those more traditional, almost backwards looking organizations about this aspirational view of an integrated approach to equitable infrastructure you brought forward.
Well, this is why I think the Arizona Department of Transportation model is so interesting. There are more progressive states than Arizona, yeah. In the US, that's for sure. And so I did not expect that the corridor study would necessarily have within it that idea that this is possible. But ADOT had partnerships already with several environmental organizations that surround the interstate, and a couple forward-thinking people within the Department of Transportation, within the agency. So the fact that idea that they could do some symbiotic bundling and that they were also in charge of the transit studies. So ADOT was responsible for studying the potential for high-speed rail connecting Tucson to Phoenix and connecting Phoenix to Las Vegas. With their partners at Nevada Transportation. That was already a small part, but it was already a part of that corridor study. So that was a pleasant surprise coming in, but then we included them. I mean, they were in our studio, they gave presentations, they were there for reviews. And I think that's one of the benefits of allowing to test these things out in academic situations. Mm-hmm. We are not accountable to the state financial resources in terms of how we're allocating transportation dollars. And I always say our job is to show what's possible as an alternative to what's probable. And so not only was ADOT there in the room and they were participating with us, but like I said, when I was giving presentations to people who were planning on being transportation planners or to transportation organizations, I would invite our ADOT partners to come so that they were there in the room saying, no, we want to do this. We want to do this. And so that was one small way to capitalize on that little seed of hope that was in their document and sort of blow it up to sort of a much bigger opportunity. I think the other thing is using this sort of idea of breaking down silos in agencies and in disciplines. And agencies get interested when you tell them that it provides access to other kinds of funding. Mm-hmm. So there are some models out there that show how funding from the EPA has been helpful in a transportation project, or funding from the EPA has been helpful, in a dam project, so that they can do positive ecological things while still fulfilling their mission. And, we kind of are at a tipping point where people are demanding that our infrastructure respond to climate change. Otherwise, we are victims of collapse. We are victims of obsolescence. So this is a moment. This is kind of a moment to capitalize on. And I hope we can show the agencies that the cost of not doing things is much higher than the cost of doing them in the long run, and even in the short run for some of these projects.
No, I mean, I think that's what's so nice about the way you've so clearly, the analytical work that you've done in terms of the cost benefit analysis piece, and then being able to demonstrate that on the map is one of the things. It again demonstrates the interdisciplinarity that you're talking about, but it is the crossing silos in terms of being able to speak to both the agencies, but also to the community organizations, so that they understand what the advocacy mission here that you can be a part of. And indeed, I agree with you that studio instruction is a big part of making that possible in many ways. I mean, one of the things that people are asking is a little bit, I think some of our folks know St. Louis and know some of the towns in specific. And I was struck when you were talking about St. Louis. I have colleagues who worked on East St. Louis and activism in East St. Louis for many, many years as planners. And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how connecting to the community, in addition to connecting to the agencies, allows you to sort of push the optimism and the idea of expanding alternatives and possibilities.
Well, and I didn't talk about the broadening the process part of the Mobility for All by All project. And it was huge in that project, and I'm happy to provide the link to the full report and the images from that. But we spent almost all of our grant money on providing funding for arts organizations to do their own engagement with the community. Because my theory is always people who are in the community, who have been working in the community for a long period of time, who are engaged with local residents, who are local residents, are more in touch with what's going on than I am ever going to be, no matter how much I know. So we actually selected 3 arts-based or arts activism organizations along the north side, south side line, and gave them small grants and said, they gave us a proposal. And we asked them, like, how do you go into the neighborhood that you already serve and determine ways that you might provide information back to Metro about what people in the neighborhoods want out of their transit. So one of them was this great organization called Social Impact, spelled SEW. And so her project is all about teaching kids to sew. So the money that we gave to that organization bought sewing machines, and the kids made quilts about what they see as the future of transit. And then they displayed those quilts to the neighborhood and had conversations with their neighbors. And it was just, these are kids. And you think, well, kids aren't riding transit. Well, they are. Transit's not only are they riding it now, but the north side, south side line is going to take 20 years to build. And they're not going to be kids when it's built, right? They're potentially going to be residents and users and employees and employers. Another one was a project that we funded in Dutchtown, which is a major intersection of several communities and the new line. And we funded the Dutchtown South Community Corporation to do a hip hop video with people riding the bus. So they got a local guy who was well known, took his camera and got on the bus and started talking to bus riders and created a video of what is it like to be a rider, a bus rider, and what would it be like to be able to have more reliable transportation in the city. So that's part of what we've been doing with the Mobility for All by All in terms of engaging the community. And those are really alternative ways. I'm a big advocate of not letting an organization say, well, you need to come to our office and it needs to be at this time. And, you need to rubber stamp our existing plan.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was in terms of if you looked at this outside of the U.S. context, right? And particularly that you've got this very nice structure of principles to take forward into other projects. And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit. You were talking a little bit about sort of within the context of St. Louis, the political nature of crossing ward boundaries and that's sort of the inside the city sort of question of scale. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about moving from the city to the regional scale. And you were talking about between city regions as well when you were talking about the Arizona context.
Yes.
And even cross-national when we look into the Nogales South aspect of this. Right. So I wonder a little bit about your experiences with with borderlands experiences and those regional experiences as well.
Yeah, I would say to skip projects a little bit. So one of the partners that I've worked with recently is Virgin Hyperloop One. And sort of miraculously, Missouri, the little piece of Missouri from St. Louis to Kansas City was one of the finalists to potentially be the first segment of Hyperloop in the US.
Yeah.
And that is for many reasons, one of which it was the first segment of the Interstate that was actually completed, but it's also because the right-of-way around Interstate 70 is all owned by the DOT. And so that would make property acquisitions fairly easy. And it's also relatively flat comparatively, compared to the Vegas to LA connection or some of the connections in Texas. But what we looked at with VHO and with our students is the advantages of resource sharing at the national level through a strategy of interconnectivity that is not fossil fuel dependent, right? So we saw this in the immediate response to COVID. All of a sudden, we had all of these shortages of protective gear, or we had these shortages of parts, and you had architecture schools that were like getting their 3D printers, kicking them into gear to make PPO parts, right?
Yep.
And so part of I was finishing the book at that time, and I was like, I can't write about this. I need to write about this, what's going on right now. So the last chapter of the book is really how to think about these things at this sort of regional and national scale, how we might build a better system that is about distributing goods nationally and, and connecting into the international network in a way that doesn't rely on trucking, right? Right now we have you look at the backlog at Long Beach and LA, every one of those containers, not everyone, a lot of those containers that are going to come off those ships are going to get on trucks. Many of them are going to get on trains. But how do we build a system that's going to create this large system interconnectivity of distribution and service that's faster, more fuel efficient, run by renewable energy, serves maybe creativity on demand, so that it's not really we're storing a lot of stuff, then we're moving a lot of stuff, then we're storing a lot of stuff, and then we're moving it again. So that work with Virgin Hyperloop One is really some of the most interesting kind of regional and mega regional work that I've been doing.
So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because as you may know, many of we have some of our colleagues in the regional studies community, including myself, have done a lot of work on advanced manufacturing and have been concerned about these supply chain issues for a while, global production networks, and in addition to that, whether the systems are sustainable from an economic perspective, also concerned about this issue of the impacts on the built environment and the question of the restrictions that it places on that the system places on cities and regions in terms of their alternatives for creating these sustainable spaces that you're articulating. So I really think that the connection here is super important for us to sort of cross the boundaries and get all on the same team here as well. So I want to thank you for your participating and giving this amazing presentation, making us all think today. And I have just a couple of things to share as we close out with our audience. First, I just want to, of course, thank the audience for being here. And again, thank the Regional Studies Association team for making this possible. They do just an amazing job. And I also want to put a little bit of an advertisement in for my colleagues at Regional Studies, Regional Science. Their annual lecture is coming up on Monday on the 8th of November. And Jeff Boeing from USC, University of Southern California, will be talking about urban mobility and street and network science. And if you check the Regional Studies Association website, you'll see the details there on how to join that lecture. And again, Linda, thank you so much for this. So appreciate your insights here. And I think we may be applying your model shortly.
Well, I was just going to put my email in the chat in case anybody else wants to follow up. I know there's a bunch of questions still, so feel free to email me if you have a project you want to talk about or further questions. And I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for inviting me, and lovely chatting with you as well, Jennifer.
You as well. Thank you, everyone. Take care.